by viewers like you and by the following.
Hey, bud, how's pajama day?
It means school picture day.
No.
Life isn't always simple, but eating Heart Smart for American Heart Month is. Look for displays of heart-healthy California walnuts at Jewel Osco.
This is our great-grandfather, who had a dream in 1945 to open a family business in his name. This is our grandfather, who expanded on that dream, bringing custom furniture to Chicago. This is our father and his brothers, who grew that dream into the 10 showrooms here today. This is us, 4 sisters who want to make the generations before us proud while making Chicago homes beautiful. Since 1945, this is Smith.
Sometimes a man may seem to be virtuous, while all the time he may be harboring a secret.
WTTW programming originates from the Renee Crown Public Media Center.
Hey, bud, how's pajama day?
It means school picture day.
No.
Life isn't always simple, but eating Heart Smart for American Heart Month is. Look for displays of heart-healthy California walnuts at Jewel Osco.
Hi, Chicago. I'm Destiny. You're watching WTTW.
This evening's presentation of Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Jim and Kay Mabey.
Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Brandis Friedman.
And I'm Paris Schutz. On the show tonight,
CPS has finally reached a tentative agreement with the Chicago Teachers Union.
we have the latest on the tentative deal between CPS and CTU on bringing students back into the classroom.
I didn't know I was going to be here, okay? But I'm here.
A giant in the Chicago education community has fallen. Former Chicago Teachers Union President Karen Lewis dies at 67 years old.
Truth and accountability are essential.
The Senate prepares for the impeachment trial of former President Donald Trump over allegedly inciting an insurrection attempt at the U.S. Capitol.
A lot of times higher ed is forgotten.
Who's deserving of the coronavirus vaccine and in what order? Some workers say Illinois' priority list isn't fair.
Could passengers on domestic flights soon be tested for COVID before takeoff? That and more business news from Cranes.
Meeting consent decree requirements. The Chicago Police Department releases a status report as critics call it a public relations effort.
How the pandemic has brought on mental health challenges for young people and what they're doing to combat it.
In the last polar vortex, we got calls from around the world about it, which was kind of surprising to us.
Metra's fiery system for keeping tracks from freezing sparks interest every year. We explain the attention-grabbing approach.
And revisiting a show of paintings by the French Impressionist Claude Monet and the Chicago garden they inspired. But first, some of today's top stories. The head of the Chicago Department of Family and Support Services announces she's stepping down. Lisa Morrison Butler has led that office, tasked with caring for Chicago's most vulnerable residents for the last 8 years. Morrison Butler says her decision was influenced by a health scare she had recently and the need to have more professional and personal flexibility. She'll be replaced on an interim basis by First Deputy Brandy Kanazi. And Illinois public health officials report more than 1,700 new cases of the coronavirus in the last 24 hours, as well as 35 additional deaths. That makes for a statewide total of 1.14 million cases, along with 19,668 deaths. And are you sick of the extreme cold? Tough. The deep freeze is here to stay through the week, and the city could see 1 to 3 inches of new snow before this latest round is done, followed by wind chills well below zero overnight. The frigid temperatures aren't expected to relent until the middle of next week, And both Chicago and suburban Cook County operate warming centers during the week, usually between the hours of 9 and 5. After threats of a strike on one side, locking teachers out of their virtual classrooms on the other, and myriad complaints from parents, a reopening deal between Chicago Public Schools and the city's teachers union is finally in sight. Brandis Friedman, who's been covering the standoff over the return to in-person learning, joins us now. Brandis, what's the latest?
Well, Paris, for now, teachers and the union may have averted a teacher strike, but it is not a done deal just yet. Yesterday, Mayor Lori Lightfoot announced CPS and CTU had reached a tentative agreement to phase in a return to in-person learning, starting with some students and teachers as soon as this week.
At long last, CPS has finally reached a tentative agreement with the Chicago Teachers Union that opens up the school doors for safe in-person learning for our pre-K, cluster, and K through 8 students.
And so here's what we know about this deal so far. Pre-K and special education cluster students would return to school this Thursday. Kindergarten through 5th grade would come back on March 1st, and 6th through 8th graders on March 8th. Now, high school students would remain fully remote for now. The agreement also lays out a framework for COVID-19 testing for teachers and students, as well as a threshold for closing schools again should cases spike. Returning to in-person learning is, of course, not mandatory for CPS families. Most have elected to stick with remote learning. Now, we should reiterate that none of this is finalized. The CTU's House of Delegates is meeting as we speak. Now, that's the 500 or so members elected to represent their schools. They'll decide if the deal should be sent on to the union's rank and file for a vote of the full membership. We're told the union could possibly hold a vote tomorrow with a final answer by Wednesday.
Brandis, one of the main points of contention here between the two groups has been the district's vaccination plan for teachers. What do we know about how that fits into this agreement?
Right. So CPS officials say the staggered approach to returning, as opposed to the original plan of bringing all of K through 8 back on the same day, that is meant to give teachers more time to get vaccinated. They'll also provide doses exclusively to teachers every week through a city-run site.
We will begin vaccinating 1,500 CPS employees per week through our own vaccination sites, which will open later this month and be exclusively for Chicago Public Schools employees. That's in addition to the city's Protect Chicago Plus program, which will prioritize vaccinations for staff who live and work in communities that have been hit hardest by COVID.
Brandis, you know, I think the whole city knows tempers have been running high between CPS and CTU seemingly since that first strike a year and a half ago. Is this tension here to stay?
I think a lot of parents hope not, Paris, and there's certainly no love lost between the mayor and the union, especially since it's been only about a year and a half since that 2019 teacher strike. But Mayor Lightfoot yesterday did personally thank CTU President Jesse Sharkey for his work at the bargaining table and offered an olive branch of sorts to the union.
We will invariably not agree on every issue. But my request, my plea, is that we have to figure out a way to disagree in ways that does not cause permanent damage to all concerned, particularly when our children are involved.
And of course, it remains to be seen whether the union will approve this contract offer. I should probably mention that CTU leadership has been resistant to calling this a tentative agreement. They want their membership to weigh in first. Of course, if membership does not accept this offer, we'll have to see what happens next if the two sides are willing to return to the bargaining table, Paris.
And Brandis, teachers are going to be thinking this over on this day when the news comes that their former president, Karen Lewis, has died. Tell us about that.
That's right. So Karen Lewis, she was legendary within the union. Some say even outside of the union. This morning, CTU confirmed Karen Lewis's death, saying that she didn't just lead the movement, she was their movement. As the leader of more than 25,000 Chicago public school teachers, Karen Lewis became the rock star of the Chicago Teachers Union.
Head teacher in charge! Head teacher in charge!
Taking the stage to thousands of cheering teachers and supporters during a massive 2015 demonstration in Grant Park.
This time last year, I didn't know I was going to be here. Okay? But I'm here.
Posing for selfies with students and parents during a one-day walkout in 2016.
We love you!
Lewis was elected CTU president in 2010 after 22 years teaching in Chicago public schools, high school chemistry at King College Prep, and then Lane Tech High. In her role as president, she was never one to bite her tongue, fearlessly calling out the policymakers she felt were wrong in their treatment of teachers and children.
Chicago's public school educators will stand up for what is just and fair, and together we will fight to protect our professions and our classrooms.
This is how she felt that you should talk to people who were, in her mind, abusing children, right? Not treating teachers respectfully. And she genuinely believed that if you spoke that way, you'd be speaking truth to power.
Under her leadership, nearly 25,000 teachers historically walked off their jobs for the first time in 25 years. The strike of 2012 would last 7 days.
Whose choice was this?
Few would disagree that Lewis and her leadership changed the function of the collective bargaining process, making it more than just a fight for teacher pay and benefits. During those contract negotiations, attorney Jim Franzik sat across the table from Lewis, representing the Board of Education. Even he gives Lewis credit.
We went through some enormously difficult challenges during the last two contracts with Karen and made some very fundamental changes in the way in which we operate the Chicago public schools.
After that strike, Lewis began to hear the calls to run, Karen, run. And she almost did. But her plans to challenge then-Mayor Rahm Emanuel for his job ground to a screeching halt in the fall of 2014.
Karen Lewis has a serious illness. She underwent surgery yesterday, and that was successful.
A serious brain cancer diagnosis would prohibit her from seeking higher office. But Karen Lewis was a consummate fighter for teachers and students, as well as her own life.
The first thing I went through my mind is, okay, so what do we do? You know, I mean, it's just, again, it's all about problem solving for me. It always has been. So, I mean, it's like, that's it. Okay, so what do we do?
Months later, Lewis did return and kept up the fight for CTU members. Post-cancer, a slimmer Lewis traded her signature locked hair for various hats. And under all those hats, those who knew her say, a brilliant mind.
She speaks 2 or 3 languages, French, Italian. She picked up a good amount of Yiddish and Hebrew when she was converting. She converted to Judaism. She's a gourmet cook. She was a stand-up comic. She's a voracious reader of virtually every kind of book on the spectrum you can get. She's an opera aficionado. She's a ballet aficionado.
Another Karen Lewis signature was her quick wit.
I've got swampland in Brooklyn to sell them, because there's plenty of it. I've got beachfront property in Iowa for them.
Everybody's leaving Illinois. And if you believe that, I got a bean to sell you.
And though her relationship with Chicago Public Schools leadership was often contentious, current CEO Janice Jackson says their relationship was special.
She gave me advice as an African-American leader, a young woman, about work, and I can just remember several conversations over the course of the past few years where it wasn't just about, you know, CTU wants this or CPS needs to stop doing that. You know, I feel like she really cared about me as a young leader and wanted to see me be successful.
And in addition to her cancer diagnosis and treatment in 2014, Lewis suffered a stroke in 2017. Then the cancer returned in 2018, the same year she retired. She was 67 years old. And now back to you, Paris, for a preview of the impeachment trial.
Branda's former President Donald Trump's second impeachment trial begins tomorrow. All signs point to a lack of enough GOP senators for conviction, but Democrats argue Congress has a duty to make clear the truth of what happened on January 6th. Here's a little bit of Trump's speech at a rally of supporters that day, which Democrats and some Republicans say triggered the violent insurrection at the Capitol.
We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft involved. Our country has had enough. We will not take it anymore, and that's what this is all about.
And joining us now with more are Connie Mixon, political science professor and director of the Urban Studies program at Elmhurst University, and Michael Kang, constitutional law professor at Northwestern University's Pritzker School of Law. Welcome back, both of you. So the rules have been set forth now, agreed to by Senate Majority Leader Schumer, Minority Leader McConnell. Opening statements, 16 hours of debate by both sides, and 4 hours of questioning by senators. Connie Mixon, how do you anticipate this trial will go this week?
Well, there's no real set guideline for the time it will take. I think it will be over relatively quickly. Donald Trump's first impeachment trial lasted about 3 weeks. Bill Clinton's lasted about 4 weeks. I think by all accounts, both sides would like it to be over sooner rather than later. They have other things that they would like to move on to doing, particularly Democrats. And just as we were taping today, we learned that there has been agreement, and they have come to agreement about the terms of the Senate trial, and it looks like they'll probably wrap up early next week.
And there's certainly a lot of other business that Congress has to get to. Michael Kang, before the actual substance of the trial, there's disagreement over the constitutionality of trying an ex-president. The president's lawyers say it's unconstitutional. 45 Republican senators agree. What say you?
Well, it's not addressed explicitly by the Constitution, but this is something that the Senate's considered in the past a number of times, and always held that impeachment trial, even after a federal official leaves office, is constitutional. And they've proceeded. They've had these trials in the past for cabinet members, for judges. So while it's not addressed explicitly in the Constitution, I think the precedent is fairly clear. It's fair for the Republicans to bring this up and raise this question during the trial, and they'll vote on it, because really everything in impeachment is decided by the Senate, and courts generally stay out of it. So it'll be up to the Senate to decide this question. It sounds like this week.
So as you say, there is precedent for this. Let's listen to both sides of the aisle here on their views of this trial going forward.
Impeachment is a political process. We've never impeached a president once they're out of office. 45 plus Republicans are going to vote early on that it's unconstitutional. It's not a question of how the trial ends. It's a question of when it ends.
Truth and accountability are essential. Some people say, oh, let this go away. Oh, no. When something as horrible, as dastardly that happened on January 6th occurs, you cannot sweep it under the rug. You must have all the truth come out, and then the accountability once the truth comes out.
Connie Mixon, barring a major change of heart from at least a dozen GOP senators, the votes simply aren't there right now to convict. So what is the point of a trial if it will likely end up in an acquittal?
Right. I think you're correct. As everything is seen through such a partisan lens, the outcome is a foregone conclusion. But in my view, the Senate needs to proceed with a trial, particularly when presented with an article of impeachment from the House. And doing less than this will send a message that future presidents can evade responsibility. Ultimately, there has to be some reckoning with what occurred on January 6th. And I think that's the point of it. And I think the House managers will also be making their case to the public and documenting for future generations and historians what did occur during this time.
And Michael Kang, the charge here is incitement of insurrection. Even GOP Congresswoman Liz Cheney put the onus squarely on Trump for what happened on January 6th. Talk to me about the strength of the case that you believe the House managers are bringing here.
Well, I think I agree with Connie that Donald Trump's conduct here is quite outrageous. It's an assault on another branch of the federal government, on the democratic process. And so I do think the Democrats in particular really feel a need to make a statement here, even though Trump has left office, that they need to make clear that this is unacceptable behavior and this is disqualifying behavior. I mean, I think the question right now is not whether to remove Donald Trump from office. He's gone since January 20th. The question is whether he ought to be eligible to run for federal office again.
And is there any way to have that vote based on the 14th Amendment without a conviction in an impeachment trial?
Yeah, it's less clear under the 14th Amendment, under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. There's just not a lot of precedent on that. It's clear that Congress has to do something in terms of execution of that provision of the 14th Amendment. It's not self-executing.
A lot of uncharted territory here. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
Connie. The defense so far, based on legal briefs filed by Trump's lawyers, is that Trump cannot be held responsible for the action of what they say are a small group of criminals. Is that a compelling defense?
I don't think it is. You're right. They're going to start out, in fact, tomorrow, making the argument over again about whether or not even holding the trial is constitutional, and that the president's words, even if they're lies, are protected under the First Amendment, and that he didn't incite the actual rioters. But you know, our Bill of Rights are designed to protect citizens from the actions of our government. And Donald Trump, when he said those words, he was our government. He was our president. And ultimately, I think a lot of it is to sow doubt about the seriousness of what happened on January 6th. And, you know, I think the important thing is for House managers to keep their focus on the actual article of confederation or article of impeachment and focus on how the president incited that riot and hold to their case. And to me, the defense doesn't hold much water.
And Michael King, we only have a few seconds left, but beyond impeachment, Congresswoman Cheney also mentioned the fact that there could be future actual prosecution based on the president's words. Do you anticipate some kind of criminal investigation?
It's clear that Donald Trump would be subject to criminal prosecution if someone chose to go that way, but I sort of doubt that will happen. I think that's politically complicated, and I would be surprised if prosecutors went forward with a case like that.
All right, a lot to watch for this week. Thank you so much for joining us. Our thanks to Connie Mixon and Michael Kang. And up next, a look at who's eligible for the COVID vaccine and who isn't. So stick around.
What can you tell us about how Chicago small businesses are doing? These are more than just shopping centers for the community. They're gathering places where they maintain their culture.
According to the latest Illinois Department of Public Health data, about 2.35% of Illinois' population is fully vaccinated, which means millions more are still waiting. Many won't even have the opportunity for months. And as our Amanda Vinicky reports, some groups say that's not fair. Amanda.
Brandis, it can be hard to find common ground on pretty much anything these days, but I'm guessing that there's at least near universal agreement on this much, that it stinks when somebody cuts in line. And when it comes to getting the COVID-19 vaccine, folks are learning that the line to get it is long.
We just have a limited number of vaccines right now, and the doses are not all there for everyone that wants them.
Democratic State Senator Julie Morrison and Republican Senator Sue Rezin both say that they are getting calls daily from frustrated constituents, often elderly folks who want to get the COVID-19 shot, but can't figure out when, how, where. It is Governor J.B. Pritzker who has decided who essentially gets to be at the front of the line for getting one, which populations anyway. And Rezin says that he has made some wrong choices.
I mean, it doesn't make any sense to inoculate healthy prisoners over people who are most at risk of dying from COVID-19. Those are the phone calls that I hear, and I agree with them as well.
There is really pretty broad agreement that Illinois did get it right in the first phase, 1A. That's when the vaccine was going to healthcare employees, doctors, nurses, also residents and employees of long-term care facilities like nursing homes. It is the current phase, 1B, that is causing consternation. That's when people over 65 are eligible, also certain frontline workers. The governor, who gets to, again, make that call, also put state legislators and prison workers also in that phase. Ellen Mills with the Uptown People's Law Center says it's for good reason. COVID-19 spreads in congregate settings like prisons and jails where physical distancing, he says, is impossible. Plus, guards going in and out of these facilities can lead to community spread if they get it within the prison walls. I asked him to respond, however, to critics who say that those who have broken the law shouldn't get preference.
Since I am a lawyer, I'll give you the legal answer, which is that for prisoners, it's not a privilege. It is a constitutional right. Unlike everybody else in society, because we take away the ability of prisoners to seek their own medical care, the United States Supreme Court held back in the 1970s that the state has an obligation to provide medical care to prisoners.
Mills also says that there is a moral reason for vaccinating prisoners and inmates.
Prisoners themselves should be treated like everybody else in this regard. They committed a crime, but they didn't lose their humanity.
There's also the issue of who is considered an eligible frontline worker. Teachers lately have gotten a whole lot of attention, and they are eligible in Phase 1B. But professors and others in higher education in Illinois, they aren't.
I feel that a lot of times higher ed is forgotten. In K-12 in education, it's a lot of focus on K-12, and we're just all as important.
While many faculty and university employees are working remotely, others, well, they are working on campus.
This is particularly true of the studios, the labs, even some physical therapy classes, a lot of the hands-on that simply cannot be taught in a remote fashion. Additionally, we also represent some building service workers, food service workers. These are people that are cleaning the dorms, cleaning the classrooms, and in some cases, even cleaning where the testing is occurring.
President of University Professionals of Illinois, John Miller, says that the union agrees that those who are working virtually can wait, given especially the shortage of coronavirus vaccine available. But he says that those college workers who are working on campus, he says that they should also get 1B status.
Think about it, you even have state universities that have dorms open, and there's building service workers and service workers in those dormitories that are cleaning and keeping those and dealing with the maintenance, coming in contact with a lot of students, that they should be included as well.
I don't want to go back to work and realize that some of those people that I used to talk to are now dead. Having access to the vaccine is what we're talking about. You know, for those that really need it, please include them in that 1B, because they have to go into these buildings. They have to go day to day.
Also going into buildings day to day, Chicago librarians. And they also are not considered to be eligible in 1B per the city's rules. And they say if that's the case, they should be able to go back to working remotely until they are vaccinated. Now, the Illinois Senate does have a hearing scheduled for Thursday that is focused on vaccines.
Why are some people being categorized as 1B and others are not? And what happens after 1B? 1C, 1D, 2A? I think it's time to share all this information with the public.
It is not just the order of distribution, allocation, these phases. Senators tell me that they also want to ask questions and get to the bottom of why it is that Illinois is lagging behind other states in administering that is, the doses that it does have of the COVID-19 vaccine. Brandis, back to you.
Amanda, thank you. Up next, a look at the way Metra keeps trains running during the brutal winter weather.
Coverage of science and technology on Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Joel M. Friedman, president of the Alvin H. Baum Family Fund.
And there's much more ahead on the program, including a look at whether the Chicago Police Department is meeting consent decree requirements. But first, this past weekend saw dangerously cold weather with wind chills as low as 30 below. And the week ahead doesn't appear to offer much relief. But just because Chicago is in the grip of a cold snap doesn't mean the city comes to a total standstill. Chicago Tonight's Nick Blumberg reports on an eye-catching method that Metra uses to keep its trains running.
It's colder than Antarctica in Chicago.
When dangerously cold polar vortex air had Chicago in its grip 2 years ago, the Windy City got worldwide attention. And it wasn't just the frigid temps that attracted eyeballs.
Chicago is so ridiculously cold
that in order to keep trains running, they had to deliberately set the train tracks on fire. That's called Chicago improv.
It does look like we light the tracks on fire, and it's a question we get every year, is Metra lighting the tracks on fire? The tracks aren't actually on fire. There's just a little gas burner next to them. It's like a gas stovetop.
They're called switch heaters. They keep the switches that allow trains to move from one track to another from freezing up.
They keep the moving parts moving. They keep snow and ice from mucking up the mechanism, and it just basically keeps our on-time performance up.
Gillis says there's a busy section of track near Grand and Western built nearly a century ago when gas switch heaters were still common.
A more modern switch heater is more like a hot air blower, like a giant hair dryer. But we can't retrofit this plant with that sort of technology.
That's because the tracks are too densely laid to accommodate the more modern equipment. So Metra sticks with the eye-catching gas burners and occasional human intervention, like when ice and snow builds up under trains, just like it does under cars.
They rumble through those switch, and that might knock off the muck from underside the train. And if it falls straight into the switch, there's no switch heater in the world that'll clear that out quickly.
Meaning crews have to clear the tracks themselves with a broom or an ice pick. The switch heaters get attention every year, but it's not all Metra does to keep trains running. After the polar vortex in 2019,
we went out and bought these big cold air blowers to clear snow and ice from the yards. They have a blast of like 525 miles per hour.
So whether you see Metra whipping up its own windstorm or a train rumbling over fiery tracks in your Twitter feed, just remember, it's not Chicago improv, just old-fashioned ingenuity. For Chicago Tonight, I'm Nick Blumberg.
Metra says it uses the more modern switch heaters in other locations where there's enough room for them, but those typically don't garner the same attention as the gas burners. Still to come on Chicago Tonight, a microchip shortage is plaguing the automobile industry, including the Jeep Cherokee plant in Belvidere. That and more from Cranes. Is the Chicago Police Department meeting consent decree requirements? Leaders say it has accelerated compliance efforts. How young people are coping with mental health challenges like depression and isolation brought on by the pandemic. And exploring Monet and his connection to Chicago at the Art Institute and the Garfield Park Conservatory. But first to Paris for more of today's top stories. Paris.
Thank you, Brandis. Could Chicago soon see an increase in indoor dining? Mayor Lori Lightfoot hinted today that the city was planning an announcement for later this week that would involve guidance for restaurants in anticipation of the normally very lucrative Valentine's Day holiday. Restaurants are currently allowed to operate at 25% capacity indoors, but that could soon be expanded to 50% given the steadily falling COVID-19 positivity rate.
Our restaurants have been extraordinarily hard hit. Restaurants, bars, our hospitality industry in general. Valentine's weekend is one of the few bright spots for the restaurant industry over the course of the first quarter, which is a tough time for them. January, February are typically down. There's ground to be made up. I'm very well aware of that. We're in daily conversations with the leading trades for the restaurants.
And state public health officials report more than 1,700 new cases of the coronavirus in the last 24 hours, as well as 35 additional deaths. That makes for a statewide total of 1.14 million cases with 19,668 deaths. And now back to Brandis for some of today's top business headlines. Brandis.
Paris, thank you. The director of the CDC suggests passengers on domestic flights be tested for COVID-19 before boarding. The Jeep Cherokee assembly plant in Belvidere is shutting down for a week unrelated to the pandemic. And Chicago-based Mondelez International closes one of its Nabisco factories. Here to go behind the headlines is Crane's Chicago business editor, Ann Dwyer. So, Ann, we know that the head of the CDC is recommending that passengers be tested for COVID before boarding. Any word on whether this plan will be put in place soon?
It sounds like right now, Brandis, that it's a tentative notion. Of course, it would be a huge step if the federal regulators were to actually take up the CDC director's suggestion on this. Basically, she observed today that testing before flights would certainly curb the spread of COVID, and analysts say she's not wrong about that. The question is how to implement it. Pete Buttigieg, the new transportation secretary, told Axios today that this idea is under consideration at the highest levels within the Biden administration. Of course, we'll be watching the situation very closely since O'Hare and United Airlines are such huge pillars of the Chicago economy.
Absolutely, and we should specify they're discussing this for domestic flights right now.
Yeah.
So the Jeep Cherokee assembly plant in Belvidere is shutting down for a week. What do we know about why?
Well, it's the same problem that idled Ford's Torrance Avenue factory earlier this month, and also factories nationwide. And that's basically that these little microchips that run everything in your car, from stereo systems to mapping devices to your brakes, are simply in very short demand globally. Most of these chips are made in China, and analysts have been saying in reports today that the situation with these microchips shipments would have been bad under COVID conditions anyway, but the previous administration in Washington may have exacerbated the problem by being sort of antagonistic toward China. So this could be kind of a lagging indicator of the trade woes that the Trump administration got into in some of its fights with Beijing. Long story short, this is a 1-week shutdown at the Jeep plant. We'll see if they can get back up and running by next week.
And this might be some scary news for cookie lovers. Chicago-based Mondelez International shutting down a Nabisco plant in New Jersey, and there's concern about where the jobs are going. What has the company said about that?
Well, it's a long-time production plant out there. They make everything from Oreos to Lorna Doones in this plant. 600 people work there and have done for decades. But Mondelez says the plant is outmoded and they're going to move production elsewhere. What's noteworthy, and you're right, Brandis, this is different, is they are saying that they're going to move production within the United States. Now, a few years ago, Mondelez generated some negative headlines when they moved production of Oreos to Mexico. And they were explicit in saying they are not doing that this time. So that was very noteworthy.
Okay, Crane Chicago business editor Ann Dwyer, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And now to Paris for a look at whether CPD has been meeting its consent decree requirements. Paris.
Brandis, Chicago Police Department leaders say they're making progress on the consent decree. That's the court-ordered mandate for police reform. In a recent report released by the CPD itself, the department says it has, quote, doubled down on its efforts to accelerate compliance since March. This comes as CPD has been criticized for dragging its heels a bit on keeping up with those reform mandates, and before another progress report is set to be released by the Independent Monitor. And joining us to discuss the report are Sheila Betty, a civil rights attorney from Northwestern University's Pritzker School of Law, who has been involved in the consent decree litigation; Robert Boyk, executive director of the CPD's Office of Constitutional Policing and Reform; and Nusrat Chaudhary, legal director at the ACLU of Illinois, which is involved in the consent decree litigation. Welcome all of you to Chicago tonight. Sheila Betty, remind us where CPD is right now in the consent decree process and what the ultimate goal here is.
Well, the consent decree process came about after the Obama Justice Department came to Chicago, conducted a wide-reaching investigation, and confirmed what people have long known about the Chicago Police Department, that it is violent, that it is racist, that it is lawless. And this consent decree was supposed to transform the department, was supposed to address many of the policy and practice deficiencies that have led to those conclusions and that really informed that investigation. What we've seen so far, the decree's been in place since March of 2019, that the department has not taken the decree seriously, and that the implementation of the decree has failed to make a real difference in the way policing happens in the city of Chicago.
Robert Boyk, as we mentioned, the CPD put out this report saying it is accelerating its compliance with this decree. Do you agree with that CPD hasn't taken this decree seriously?
No, I don't. And actually, one of the main factors in this report that I think is noteworthy to highlight is the fact that we submitted more materials to the Monitor this time around than we did in the first two reporting periods combined, which is significant because if you want a grade on your homework, you have to turn it in. It isn't just a quantity conversation, it is a quality conversation as well. And that really is up to the Monitor to determine whether or not what we submitted meets the mark of compliance.
So, Nusrat, the last report from the the independent monitor said that it was missing so many deadlines. You hear CPD here saying that it's submitting far more documents now. Is that your view, that it is improving its compliance?
Well, I think it's important not to confuse activity with accomplishment. And I think while doing your homework is important, it's also important to make sure the homework's done well. And I think what we're seeing here is a lack of real engagement with the very community groups that represent the most directly impacted people in the city of Chicago, people from Black and brown communities who live and have lived police violence for years and decades. But what we need to see happen is the city truly engaging with those folks, listening to them, incorporating their input into policy, training, and not just policy and training, but practice on the ground. That is the true report card and what we're looking for.
All right, so Sheila, Betty, picking up on that, some of the North Stars here in the consent decree are better training, more constitutional policing, more transparency, an elimination of a so-called code of silence. How much further does CPD need to go to be in compliance on these specific issues?
Well, before I address that, I really want to respond to Bob and to the report itself, which talks about the fact that the department has submitted over 8,000 documents to the monitoring team and seems to really ask for some kudos for submitting those documents. I think it's critically important to note that over half of those documents were documents that the department had to produce as a result of the CPD's violent response to protesters this summer. People were out in the streets protesting in support of the movement for Black Lives. The Chicago Police Department responded with incredibly unlawful retaliatory violence. And so over half of the activity that the department talks about here is in direct response to CPD's lawless actions over the summer.
All right, Robert Boyk, I just want to give you a chance to respond to that. Is that correct, Robert, that you're talking about you're submitting more documents, but they're in relation to the CPD's response to protests over the summer?
Both are true. Yes, it is true. We submitted documents to the monitoring team as part of their after-action review of the events that transpired this summer. But it is also true that we still submitted more documents directly related to the consent decree than in the first two periods combined. But I want to respond to the point on community engagement, and it's actually a point that I really agree with. I don't think CPD will get out of the consent decree until we can figure out meaningful ways to engage the community. And that really means not just having a standalone CAPS program. We're really talking about normal day-to-day interactions between officers and members of the public that really have to improve. And how do we take that information and turn it into enforcement strategies that are community informed? So we recognize that we have work to do on that front. And I agree with the comments that we have to do better in that regard, and we're making progress on that front.
Nusrat, as we mentioned, the independent monitor is expected to submit a report pretty soon. What do you expect that report will find in terms of CPD's compliance?
Well, I think the report's going to find that, unfortunately, the city is not doing well on community engagement, because engagement means really, truly listening to the people who have shown for years that they are committed to trying to reform policing in Chicago to be more fair and more safe for all communities. And, what we saw in the last fall was the police meeting with people in a use of force working group and rejecting recommendations in a press release just minutes after a meeting. We saw community members who were brought in to talk about police in schools, and those community members said, hey, let's bring in young people who are actually impacted by police in schools, and the city not responding to that request at all. And the report that the city has just issued doesn't show that any input from young people were taken into consideration. So I anticipate that the monitor is going to give a very poor grade to the city on community engagement. And it's not about the number of hours. It's not about the number of documents. It's about what does policing look like on the ground. And this past year has shown, both, as Sheila mentioned, in the response to racial justice protests last summer, and the horrific videos that we are all seeing of wrong raids, the kinds of raids that are impacting children, the kind of raids that impacted Ms. Anjanette Young, the kind of raids that brutalize and stigmatize communities of color in this city, that the practice isn't changing fast enough.
Sheila, Betty, what about that? Despite what CPD is saying in this report, do you anticipate the independent monitor is going to come forward and say, hold on a second, the compliance still isn't there?
Well, throughout this reporting period, the clients that myself and Nusrat represent have been very engaged with the independent monitoring team and have been very clear with her about the violations that we've documented when it comes to community engagement, when it comes to the abuse that protesters endured this summer, when it comes to the wrong raids issues that Nusrat just described. We would expect and anticipate that the report would fully engage with those complaints and others. We also submitted documents to the monitoring team about the unequal policing that we saw during the pandemic when officers focused their efforts on dispersal efforts on the south and west side. So there are a number of issues that the organizations and the individuals who are most likely to endure police misconduct and police violence brought to the attention of the monitoring team. And it's our hope and expectation that the report will fully document those, because compliance with this consent decree, it is not about shifting paper. It is about eliminating the racialized violence that the CPD has been known for generations.
All right, we're going to have to keep following this, but we're going to have to leave it here for now. Our thanks to Sheila Betty, Robert Boyk, and Nusrat Chaudhary. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And now, Brandis, we go back to you.
Paris, thank you. Young people certainly have a lot on their plate. Remote learning amid the back and forth over a return to in-person school, applying to college in a pandemic, working throughout COVID. What sometimes gets swept aside from these concerns are mental health issues. And some are seeing that there's been an increase of young people suffering stress, depression, and anxiety. Joining us now with more are Dr. Judith Allen, Chief Operating Officer of Communities and Schools of Chicago, and Anthony Wright, a social worker with Chicago Public Schools. Thanks to you both for joining us on Chicago Tonight. Judith, let's start with you. Please, working throughout the city, have you noticed an increase in mental health issues among young people?
We actually have. Thank you for asking. Thank you for having us here. At Communities and Schools of Chicago, one of the things that we've seen in the school campuses that we provide support to, which is over about 170 in the Chicago public school system, is we're seeing more kids responding to anxiety because they don't know what's happening. They don't know what's going to happen next. There's no plan in place, and a lack of structure is actually creating that intense stress and anxiety that we're seeing in kids, as reported by their parents and teachers.
And Anthony, what have you heard from students about what is the most difficult part of living through this pandemic? I think you're muted, Anthony. Sorry.
I'm sorry. Thanks for having me on. One of the most difficult things that I've seen is students being able to identify their emotions, because they're so complex and they're dealing with more than just COVID-19. They're dealing with community violence. They're dealing with other issues at home. So I think the most important thing now is helping kids to identify their feelings, their emotions, and then normalizing them and then giving them the tools to better manage those emotions. But the biggest thing now is they're dealing with complex emotions, and it's really hard for them to pinpoint or articulate any one thing that's really going on right now.
And Anthony, as a social worker, you've had to switch your counseling from in-person to virtual. How has that gone for students, and what challenges does that virtual connection present?
Well, CPS has done a good job in terms of getting most students computers, but there have been problems with connectivity. Sometimes the service is not as great, and then we're having a hard time even getting some of the kids to log on for their services. And so that's been a really big challenge, getting the kids to log on, as well as having strong connectivity to provide the services.
And also, what's missing when you're not able to meet with them or to see them in person?
You said what's missing?
Yes. How does the meeting itself, how are you able to help them when you're not able to see them in person?
Well, when I don't see them in person, I normally do phone calls to the parent to consult with parents over the phone and maybe try to talk to the student over the phone just to check in. But it's really hard to gauge how a kid is doing over the phone and even remotely when the camera's not on. So it's mostly just phone calls, emails, just really trying to gauge how the students are doing. It's been a very difficult task at this point.
Judith, what are some of the signs that parents or guardians need to be looking for if they're concerned about a young person in their care?
Right. There's a distinction here, and Anthony hit on that, is being able to pay attention to the details, right? The nuances that you may not see when you're working remotely with a student. So for parents and family members, it's paying attention to those things where there's a slight difference. What's deviated from normal? I'm going to use air quotes for normal because normal is different for every child. But we're taking a look at what's normal adolescent development and when are things a little off, like they're pulling away. Maybe they like playing video games, and they decide they don't want to anymore. They're withdrawing from all the things that they actually used to love to do. We also have to be very careful that we don't try to avoid or minimize how these kids are feeling. Like Anthony was just saying, it's like help them give a voice to it. So if we see a child struggling, ask them to talk to us. Help them put words to whatever it is that they're feeling.
We spoke with Kaylee Doms. She's a senior at Plainfield Central High School about what it's like not having an outlet for stress, like sports, for example.
I think it's really tough for anybody, and I think at any age. I think a lot of what's going on in the media, it's showing what the effects it does to high schoolers. But I lost my dad when I was really young, and I remember, being 10 and having soccer kind of be my coping mechanism and my outlet, and just knowing that there's so many little girls out there and just little kids in general not having that opportunity to kind of get through whatever they're going through is really tough.
Judith, what do you recommend as healthy coping mechanisms for kids who can't find the outlet they need?
Right. With that one, it's finding some type of connectivity, because one of the aspects that we know about intramural sports or after-school clubs, it was about the socialization. So any chance we can get kids to connect to other kids, we're social creatures, and more so when we're going through adolescence. So any chance we get, whether it be Zoom, whether it be going for a walk with family, anything to be able to connect with another human being, that's going to be key. Even though it may not kind of offset what they benefit from, but it's something, that connectivity to another human being.
Kids, of course, some of them are in communities where they've seen, parents suffer from COVID. In some cases, family members or extended family members dying from it. The majority of these families in Chicago, Black and Latino. Anthony, how have you seen, dealing with family members affected by the virus, affect young people?
Well, it's really affected young people in many different ways, as you know, in terms of even having closure in terms of funerals. They've actually minimized the number of people who could go to the funeral home burial site. So a lot of young people are not really getting closure. And once again, really not being able to articulate what they're feeling. So I really, as a tool, to help normalize, ask them to maybe journal, deep breathing, meditation, exercise, just really trying to find ways to help them to cope with some of the grief that they're dealing with from the loss of a loved one. Can be very difficult for a young person, once again, because of their inability sometimes to express what they're going on, because they're dealing with so many complex emotions, not just once again, the COVID or the loss of a loved one, but other pre-existing issues that were already existing prior to.
Right, a heavy load for young people. Our thanks to Judith Allen and Anthony Wright for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for having me.
Up next, exploring Monet and his connection to Chicago at the Art Institute. But first, a look at the weather.
Chicago's home to more Claude Monet paintings than any other city, well, outside of Paris. That's because the works of the famous French Impressionist made a strong impression on local collectors beginning in the 1880s. Paintings from the Art Institute collection and from private collections have come together in a show called Monet and Chicago, which visitors can see starting this Thursday when the museum reopens. Arts producer Mark Vitale visited the show last fall. Here's another look.
Stepping into the world of Claude Monet, you see the play of light in his famous series of stacks of wheat, landscapes, and gardens. The paintings he made in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were radically different and very modern. They appealed to the well-heeled citizens of a young city that saw itself as modern.
Monet never came to Chicago, but his influence is everywhere in the museum, and I think even Chicago associates itself with the French Impressionist, and we wanted to celebrate that because we take it for granted that we have 33 Monets in our collection. Chicagoland collectors were very generous. We have works from private collections, so those are extremely exciting when you put them in dialogue with paintings that we've known about since the 1890s.
Scores of Monets were collected by the Palmer and Ryerson families. An 1888 review in the Chicago Tribune asked, "Why go to Paris since Paris has come to Chicago?"
When you're looking at a Monet, you're thinking of an artist who doesn't use the intermediary of drawing to get to where he's going. That was one of the innovations of the Impressionists, that they didn't spend the time of making careful drawings that then they would enlarge into a tableau, a painting. Everything looks like it was done in one go, and we know that he was all about observation, that he painted en plein air, outdoors, but after we've looked at them with infrared, with x-rays, with all of these wonderful scientific tools that we have at our fingertips now, we're finding out that, oh my gosh, this was an artist who struggled. This was an artist who changed his mind. This was an artist who came back in the studio, and that's where the magic happened. The first impression becomes something quite different.
Monet famously spent years painting his gardens at Giverny near Paris. This exhibit has a companion show in a garden at Garfield Park Conservatory, where a horticultural team found inspiration in the French painter.
I took elements from his paintings, the colors, the textures, specific flowers that were in his paintings and in his garden. He loved his nasturtiums, so we had to include those. And he always let them sprawl out into the pathways, just to break up the lines a little bit. Some things I found in his paintings, some things I found that were in his garden, such as Tithonia here, which is a Mexican sunflower. Dahlias, he loved his dahlias, so I had to include dahlias.
The Monet garden at the conservatory is all outdoors and will last until the weather changes. Indoors, at the Art Institute, the show, which had been scheduled to open in May, had to adapt to the new reality.
We really had to reconceive how it was going to be experienced. We have a certain way of doing things. I like benches. We don't have benches. I like very dramatic lighting in dark rooms, and of course you don't want that. You don't want people bumping into each other.
And they added extra space between paintings to encourage social distance.
I think that people who know our collection are going to be astounded and see the collection in a much different light. And also for Chicagoans, this is the exhibition about their city and about their museum.
For Chicago Tonight, this is Mark Vitale.
And the show at the Garfield Park Conservatory has obviously since closed. The exhibition at the Art Institute is called Monet and Chicago, and it runs through June 14th. Tickets to visit the museum must be purchased online in advance, and you can see more of those beautiful paintings on our website. And that is our show for this Monday night. Don't forget to stay connected with us by signing up for our daily briefing, and you can get Chicago Tonight streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and our website, WTTW.com/news.
You can also get the show via podcast and the PBS video app. And please join us tomorrow night live at 7. We talk impeachment and stimulus negotiations with Illinois members of Congress.
And a Jewish congregation that caters to the deaf and hearing impaired struggles to stay afloat. And now for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Paris Schutz.
And I'm Brandis Friedman. Thank you for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm, sponsoring a free continuing legal education program for over a decade for lawyers across the state.